move on to the next item on today's agenda, which is a report by Mrs. Rashida Dati entitled Prevention of Radicalisation and Recruitment of European Citizens by Terrorist Organisations. And the floor goes to the rapporteur.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, mes chers collègues.
Thank you very much, Madam President, colleagues. The attacks of the 13th of November plunged Europe and the world into despair, and I am sure we all have in our hearts thoughts for the victims after the national commemorations yesterday. And I think we now need to face up to our responsibilities and the trust that has been placed in us by European citizens. The report that we're debating this evening mustn't divide us. We must strive to achieve a consensus, not a soft consensus or an easy consensus, but a consensus whereby we take account of the need to fight barbarism and terrorism, which are within our bosom even now, and we have to make sure that we can close the net and exclude those who seek to exploit our openness and our rule of law, born in Europe, brought up in Europe, but which they now wish to destroy completely. There are no excuses, there are no attenuating circumstances, and we mustn't allow any sentimentality to creep in with regard to these criminals, and we have to make sure that we stand firm and not give in to cowardice vis-à-vis our responsibilities to the citizens. We decided that we would make sure that, given that the internet is one of the training places for radical terrorists, we would try to close down these quasi-Hollywood sites which try to promote barbarism, terrorism and criminality. Prison, another place where radicalisation occurs and where we have for too long now turned a blind eye. We have to bear in mind that those that have been radicalised have perhaps taken a turn towards a faith, but it is with the recruitment that is going on. We've got time bombs that are waiting to explode once they're released, and so fighting terrorism is fighting the financing of terrorism as well, and we must denounce all foreign countries today who are spending money without proper controls or transparency that go towards structures for sites of cults which go towards individuals which may be self-proclaimed imams, all of which operate on the territory of the European Union. They seek to destroy our values, they seek to depersonalize people, they are the enemies of our countries where they were born and have been brought up, and the enemy is no longer outside our walls, the enemy is within, and we have some responsibility for having created these monsters. Now we need to think about how people move around, and we must bring radicalisation to the attention of the authorities, and the PNR requirement is now going to be imposed. The Paris attacks could have been more easily identified if we had known the size of the networks and known what would lead to the carnage of last Friday. But that's not sufficient on its own, because systematic checks on our European borders must now be put in place. We've got jihadists returning to Europe, and they must be arrested on return. Now, your amendments, colleagues, are welcome on these points, but once it's been adopted, this report will only have impact if the European Commission and the Council accept that it should be implemented. So take your responsibilities, please. European citizens are expectant of us, and we must live up to their expectations. Otherwise, we will once again pay dearly. And I would bring to our socialist colleagues' attention the fact that irresponsible amendments, and I'm using my words carefully here, have been tabled, such as a rejection of control at European Union borders to try and evade proper checks on migrants, whereas terrorists have managed to infiltrate into the EU as migrants. And if we do not put these checks in place, this will be an insult to the memory of those that were killed in January and the 13th of November this year. Thank you very much.
Köszönöm a jelentéstevő Dati asszonynak a munkáját.
Thank you very much to the rapporteur, Mrs. Dati. And Mr. Avramopoulos now has the floor on behalf of the Commission.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Honourable members of the Parliament, in the aftermath of the tragic events in Paris and the developments in Brussels, we are all more than concerned. Our society is abhorred by the terror extremists are trying to poison us with. While we are still in grief for the innocent people that lost their lives in Paris, we cannot allow this to turn into a general psychosis. We cannot allow fear to prevail, because fear is also a threat. We cannot allow the terrorists to demoralise us and win, because terrorists target innocent people, but they also target our values and our way of living. We have been through this before, and we know that our strength is our unity, is our resilience. Our only way forward is to act, to prevent these actions from happening, to ensure the security of our citizens and our democracies. This report could not be more timely for our collective response to fight terrorism and radicalisation. In these challenging times for Europe, it is of crucial, of capital importance that the institutions of our Union see eye to eye on the way ahead. The European Agenda on Security, adopted in April this year, set out the principles and key actions in this area. This agenda is the reason we are not just reacting to events now. We are implementing and accelerating the actions we had already in the pipeline to strengthen our resilience to terror. An important example of one such action is the crucial new rules to control firearms that we have proposed just last week. I will very soon come forward with an action plan on their trafficking as well. Let me, however, start with our work on prevention. Our strongest partner and guarantor for the delivery of effective preventive measures is the Radicalisation Awareness Network. More than 2,000 local practitioners with different backgrounds from all over Europe are working on addressing the root causes of radicalisation. Since the year 2011, the RAN has produced policy recommendations as well as practical guidance and training material to better prevent and address radicalisation on schools and the prison and probation environment, on the foreign terrorist fighters phenomenon, and on the development of counter-narratives. The RAN has now been reinforced with the Centre of Excellence, up and running since October 1st of 2015, which will support the RAN and help it expand its reach further, even to priority third countries as the Middle East, North Africa and Western Balkans. Many of the perpetrators of these vicious acts are EU citizens, born and bred in our societies. This means that our work has to start right here, in our countries, in our societies, in our neighbourhoods. Let me now refer to the abuse of the Internet and social media for terrorist purposes. We started our engagement with the industry, and I will formally launch the EU Internet Forum on 3rd of December. I can inform you today that I will personally invite the chairman of the LIBE Committee to attend. I expect this partnership with the industry to lead to concrete outcomes in preventing and countering radicalisation leading to violent extremism. One of the key goals of this forum is to improve our cooperation in removing terrorist material that may push our youth towards radicalisation. The EU Internet Referral Unit, established within Europol, is instrumental and very helpful in this regard. It can build on the expertise of the European Cybercrime Centre within Europol, which has many years of experience in dealing with illegal content. So, we are by no means starting from zero. In this context, I welcome the call to reinforce the mandate and resources of the European Cybercrime Centre to enable it to face these new challenges. Our interinstitutional discussions to finalise the Europol reform will also touch on this. The second priority is to support the development of effective counter-narratives. There is progress in this area through initiatives such as the Syria Strategic Communication Task Force, which supports EU countries develop messages and carry out targeted communication campaigns. The Commission is both financially and politically supporting the continuation of this project. Today's report touches on several other important elements that we are working on. We are working to improve evidence and intelligence sharing across the European Union, in full respect, as it is obvious, of fundamental rights. We will look, as a matter of priority, into all available options to strengthen our tools against terrorist financing. This includes measures for freezing terrorist assets. And I will very soon propose a directive to strengthen our framework on the criminalisation of terrorist offences, particularly the travel with terrorist purpose and terrorist financing. This is how we will tackle the problem of foreign terrorist fighters. I will also soon report on the implementation of the Commission's communication on the prevention of radicalisation. I hope that we will continue our constructive dialogue on matters of security and, more specifically, the pending proposals and envisaged initiatives. We will need your full support and engagement on the difficult way ahead. Europe needs to be united and defend its values with the necessary rigour. Honourable Members, you well know about the ongoing work on different counter-terrorism measures. We will discuss in detail tomorrow and in other opportunities. Today, as you know, our discussion focused on counter-radicalisation. It focused exactly in one of the root causes of the problem and where the solution should come from as well. This report will serve us as a basis for a continued exchange of views about our prevention policy. And I would like here to express my thanks to the rapporteur, Madame Ratti, and I look forward to a very useful and constructive discussion tonight. Thank you very much for your attention.
Köszönöm Avramopoulos biztos úrnak a jelentés tárgyában tett nyilatkozatot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Avramopoulos. Two committees have produced opinions, and on behalf of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Tannock has the floor.
Paris serve as a reminder to us of the very real threat that Islamist terrorism poses to our peace, security and social cohesion. Ensuring citizens' safety and security is the primary duty of the state. Increasingly, perhaps fooled by the belief that Europe had truly entered into a time of perpetual peace, it appears that some of our governments are beginning to fail in living up to these primary duties. Addressing this problem will require tough and difficult decisions from member states. The Dati report offers a balanced and sensitive approach to what is a very divisive and politically charged subject. Whilst commitments in the report to initiatives such as the EU PNR directive are welcome, a more robust and all-encompassing overall strategy is clearly now needed as well. There is a growing sense, especially as many of the factors affecting radicalisation are often outside of the control of the state, that there is a need to move away from the ideal of preventing radicalisation and instead towards a proactive security policy of managing radicalisation, including asking difficult questions of countries' financial role, such as Saudi Arabia and Qatar.
Köszönöm a hozzászólást. Szeretném a képviselőtársaimat arra kérni, hogy egyrészt...
Thank you very much. I would ask everybody to try and keep to their time, and if you wouldn't mind speaking a bit more slowly as well, because otherwise it is very difficult for the interpreters. Mr. Jambaski has the floor on behalf of the Culture Committee.
Distinguished colleagues, we can say quite a lot on this undoubtedly relevant topic, but what we need above all is urgent measures. Yes, we have come up with this report, we have our proposals presented to the European Commission, but as I said, what we need above all is urgent measures, urgent action. We need to analyze the action of terrorists to know how they launder money, to know how come there are all these sites and books that glorify them. We have all seen the gradual radicalization of European citizens. Somehow these citizens are not integrated within European societies. I have been warning many of you against this problem because we can see this phenomenon all over the territory of the European Union. Obviously, this is a problem which is not regional. Europe faces war, and I think that we might act too late. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Mrs. Holmeyer, on behalf of the EPP. Thank you very much, Madam President, Commissioner, dear colleagues. When we turn to the issue of radicalisation, we must bear in mind the very diverse contributory factors and look at them holistically. We talk about the soft factors. They have to be looked at as well as the so-called hard factors. On the soft factor one, we've got to look at intercultural dialogue, interfaith dialogue, and we must make sure that we don't get marginalisation, so that young Muslims can feel at home and can be integrated. On the other hand, it must be abundantly clear that hate speech and inciting to violence and also subjugation of women is a real blow against human rights and women's rights. quite apart from inciting to death and mayhem. And clearly in the Salafist scene, there is actual indoctrination, indeed brainwashing going on, affecting young people, where particularly serious for people who lack an anchoring in their immediate environment. But we don't know enough about that. There's far too little research into this. How is it that young people allow themselves to be drawn into that world? It's not just a question of poverty, but some of those young people are engineers, are qualified, and yet they're going to Syria. We've got to attack that problem and solve that problem if we want to avoid radicalisation. Thank you very much.
Mr. Karim, do you accept a blue card? Yes. Mr. Karim.
Thank you, Madam President. 1 in 5 British Muslims sympathy for jihadis. Headline of the Sun newspaper yesterday. Now, this really should alarm us all, if it were true. What is actually alarming about this is that it is completely untrue. Even the survey company do not support or endorse the interpretation by the Sun newspaper, the largest circulation press in the United Kingdom. But the Sun doesn't care a damn what this House thinks.
Mr. Karim.
I'm coming to the question.
Mr. Karim, unfortunately, this isn't a question.
I will come again.
No, you have only half a minute. No. Thank you.
Ich habe beschlossen, dass ich die Frage verstanden habe.
Well, thank you. Well, I'm still waiting for the question. Of course, we all read the newspapers. I don't think you've got to attach too much credence to every headline that comes your way. I think we've got to do serious research, which is what I was suggesting. It's clear that you cannot simply tar everyone with the same brush. There are those where Islam is being abused and exploited. We've got to be very clear in our arguments and make sure that we get on to those who are really at risk. Thank you.
Gomes.
Thank you. Ana Gomez, please.
Madam President, Commissioner, this report couldn't be more relevant following the hideous terrorist attacks in Paris on the 13th of November. It's a result of a collective and intense cooperation with its rapporteur Rashida Dati. Thousands of young Europeans have left for Syria and Iraq to fight in the Islamic State's ranks. Of course, it is neither Islamic nor a state, but it's not, as some people think, closing borders or with a PNR directive that we're going to stop this radicalisation and recruitment. The fight is also political and ideological, and it has to be fought here in Europe, in our own societies, because the attackers in Paris in January and in November were Europeans, were French and Belgian. That's why we have to fight inequality, social exclusion that's felt particularly strongly by the migrant communities in districts that we have allowed to turn into ghettos of despair and resentment with 60% unemployment, like Molenbeek in Brussels, the heart of Europe today, in the grip of fear. Our collective security requires us to finish off this policy of destructive austerity, blind austerity, which also explains why, instead of having human resources and other resources strengthened, the police forces and information services are fighting with shortages, and it explains why prisons have turned into radicalisation centres instead of rehabilitation ones. It was known that this kind of attack was going to occur in Europe. We need to share, we need a political union to share information and a joint risk assessment. We need an external foreign and security policy and a common security and defence policy, as Syria, Iraq and Libya have shown. The member states of the Union have to coordinate and attack the arms trade the terrorist financing and organized crime which are associated with the capacity of terrorist organizations like Daesh or Al-Qaeda not carry on in business as usual mode with governments and states where Daesh and Al-Qaeda find financiers and facilitators. International trade, including the arms trade and the oil trade, cannot pay off our silence. The lesson to draw from the attacks in Paris is that our governments have to coordinate themselves to fight the terrorist threat and put a stop to this with a coherent European strategy, including a military dimension. Anybody who argues that we can drop data protection or fundamental liberties, or anybody who tries to stigmatize Muslims and refugees who suffer at the hands of these terrorists and therefore are flying here, that is our moral strength. We must not be cowed by the fear that the terrorists want to impose on us, destroying our freedoms and our democracy.
Madam Gomez, there is a blue card from Mr. Ujazdowski. Do you accept the blue card? Yes. Only one question and half a minute.
Miarą odpowiedzialności.
As a measure of responsibility is caring for the security of citizens, and the Parliament would do the right thing if it spoke with one voice on the protection of our external borders and implementing such initiatives as the PNR directive. I'm very surprised that you're protesting against such initiatives, and I'm asking, in the name of what principles are socialists against this? Is this your personal position, or is this the position of the entire political group? I'm very surprised with this.
No, we don't oppose the PNR. We voted for the PNR, but the PNR is only a tool and not the magic bullet to solve the problem. And yes, we are for, and I replied also to Ms. Dati, we are for the controls of borders, but we're not for the abuse of the controls to actually make racial profile and ethnic profile and to prevent migrants and refugees to come into Europe. I recall that when we had borders, more than 1 million of my citizens of my country, Portugal, passed those borders illegally to work in France.
Okay. The next speaker is Mr. Kirkhope.
Madam President, Mr. Commissioner, over 5,000 EU citizens are currently thought to be foreign fighters and radicalized. And these are our own citizens. Often they're the third or fourth generation Europeans, often educated and often with loving families. Understanding why this is the path they have chosen is one of the greatest challenges we face today, and it requires a comprehensive response. Law enforcement, civil society and governments need to work with communities and their leaders, and with schools and with prisons. We need to work with internet providers to reduce the dangerous, hate-filled and exploitative propaganda on the internet today. We need to better implement existing laws and to reduce loopholes that I'm afraid more and more our criminals exploit today. But I have to say to you, President, solutions are never found by pointing the finger of blame at each other, or indeed the demonization of entire communities, religions, or groups of people. And I'd like to support the remarks of my honourable friend, Dr. Karim, a few minutes ago, regarding the appalling way in which the media in the UK and elsewhere has reported such dangerous falsehoods, particularly only days after Paris, which undermine all of that we are working towards for the security of our citizens. Solutions are found through cooperation, through actions, and a willingness to acknowledge that these most difficult challenges are both complex and nuanced, but they can only be solved by reason, by good sense, by calmness but firmness, and by working together to resolve them.
Mr. Kirkhope, there is a blue card from Mr. Dartmouth and another from Mr. Button. I give the floor to Mr. Dartmouth.
Mr. Kirkhope, you supported Mr. Karim's critique, it was meant to be a question, of the Sun newspaper. Does this mean that in future you and Mr. Karim, and for that matter the entire Conservative Party, will decline to be supported by the Sun newspaper in forthcoming elections?
Okay.
Well, Lord Dartmouth, that's a very peculiar question you asked. I believe in the freedom of the press, but I also believe in responsible journalism and also facts. I also actually, unlike you, and thank you for your usual intervention whenever I speak, I also happen to trust the people. I trust the people, all the people of the United Kingdom. I believe that they are all people who have a contribution to make in different ways to our society without being demonized in what I think is an unfair and improper way.
Kis belső párbeszéddé alakult a hozzászólás. Pagaza úr, Tunda Ruiz.
Thank you very much for that British dialogue. Mrs. Pagatha Urtundua Ruiz has the floor.
Nem tudok szót adni képviselő úrnak, egyetlen egy oka van ennek.
No, I'm afraid I cannot take any more.
Yes. Rajta van a...
Sí, ahora sí. Muchas gracias, Presidenta.
Just a moment, please.
Okay.
Rajta van a hozzászólóknak a listáján, és a két...
Thank you very much. No, I'm afraid I can't take you. You're on the speaking list in any case. And that's why I gave the floor to another colleague, because they were not on the speaking list. Mrs. Bagatha Urtundua Ruiz.
Sí. Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President. Out of respect to every victim of terrorism, we are obliged to be effective in our fight against terrorism and in preventing fanatical and violent radicalisation. Effectiveness, legality and proportionality must be our practical guides. Out of respect to the victims and in defence of our right to life and freedom, we must be effective in fighting terrorism and in early prevention and detection of violent radicalisation. This report was already representing an overall approximation to the fight against the assassins and the murderers, and we are all necessary in this fight. After the Paris attacks, this should be an urgent gesture from Parliament so that citizens can trust their institutions. Liberals and Democrats are here to look for consensus, to overcome small selfishness or group selfishness, because we are aware of our historic responsibility. If you neutralize financing of terrorists, it's more difficult for them to recruit. We have to stop them being recruited on the social networks, and that's our obligation. Same thing applies to prisons, and we must have judicial control of these things as well, and guarantees. We must have early detection in communities so that Molenbeek doesn't arise again. We must keep oxygen away from the fanatics. I know this because I was born and brought up in a little town in the Basque Country where there were people who wanted to kill those of us who didn't think like the terrorists. Prevention is fundamental, I can tell you. We must have all the instruments that are right for real control on borders, for detecting criminals in transit, all of that with proper guarantees and judicial control. We must be brave, we must have democratic sense, and we must be patient, and we shall achieve this. We have no other option.
Következő a hozzászólónk.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Spinelli, please.
Ringrazio.
Thank you, Madam President. Can I thank Rashida Dati? She is very eager to listen to opinions other than her own. She listens to other people. And I think that the attack by the socialists is a very bad sign in the light of the Paris attacks. We must guard against the abusive intervention of the state. And we must not copy the Americans. We must combat terrorism with the rule of law. We must not imitate Blair, where in 2003 the rules of the game were changed and torture was allowed. Why is it that so many young people are signing up with ISIS? I think we've not got to the bottom of the reasons. The anti-terrorist wars were there. A large number of the foreign fighters were part of they belonged to the generation of the war against terror. We cannot fill Saudi Arabia and Qatar with weapons because they are the main sponsors. The banlieue, no investment has been made to reduce them being turned into ghettos, and Sarkozy took money out of neighbourhood policing, which was a serious error. And the recruitment is taking place, and the social media are used, internet is used to the hilt, and that and we're also seeing segregation in prisons, and that does not help.
Mrs. Lambert.
Thank you, President. And I also wanted to say that I appreciate the work that has been done on this report, that I think through working together we found much to agree on this report as it's tabled, even if we disagree on some elements, and that's not surprising. But we know we have to work within the framework of democratic values that we espouse, and which are under attack, and not only from one direction. And I don't mean the pop group. The report makes it clear that terrorism is not the prerogative of any single religion, nationality or civilization. And we also have to recognise at the moment it's an international phenomenon. We can all agree, for example, that we need to radically improve the use of the intelligence information that we have, to tackle arms trafficking, to track and disrupt terrorist financing. We'll not all agree, it's clear, on the use of PNR. My group's concerns are well known, and we feel the millions of euros to be invested in the system could be better, perhaps more effectively spent, for example, on joint investigation teams within Europol, or delivering on the effective resourcing of EU agencies, as called for in Madam Dati's report, such as CEPOL, Eurojust and Europol itself, or offering further support to the RAN network, and the Parliament thoroughly agrees with the evaluation of the Commission there. We need to strengthen local capacity to combat violent extremism. And in terms of prevention within our own communities, London's former police commissioner at the time of the London Underground bombings recently said that national security depends on neighbourhood security. Community policing depends on trusts from communities, so that people feel able and know how to report the unusual, the worrying, the suspicious. And this isn't going to happen if everyone from a particular social group is treated as a suspect and an outsider, or if every teacher or social worker is turned into a potential spy. The roles and responsibilities need to be clear, and the funding streams different. Social cohesion is essential, and those who'd increase social division and push a style of community collective guilt for terrorist acts are certainly not providing solutions. We also recognise what was said in the report about the internet as a potential vehicle for grooming for the purposes of violent extremism.
Thank you.
But we need clear rules in how we deal with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Lambert. There is a blue card from Mr. Sanyi. Do you accept a blue card? Yes. Sanyi úr, öné a szó. Kérem valahogy kapcsolja be ezt a mikrofont. Köszönöm.
Köszönöm szépen a lehetőséget, elnök asszony.
Yes, thank you, Madam President. Madam Lambert, you have given us a list of all the things that need to be done. But can we at least agree that we must begin by drying out and switching off the finance? Because there are all kinds of black markets, for example, works of art.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. I think we can agree on that, and I think there's some very helpful additional amendments from various groups in the House which are also pushing on the issue about having to dry up funding, because certainly when you're looking at the large-scale developments within Syria and Iraq, whether in Nigeria or elsewhere, it's clear that there's a stream of arms coming in there. But I think we also have to look at what we do to try and provide, as people have talked about, a different vision, because it's that vision of the future, a distorted one, I think, which is also creating many of the problems.
Köszönöm. Következő hozzászólás Wimberg képviselő.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Mrs. Winberg.
Thank you, Madam. I would like to begin by sparing a thought for the victims and their relatives who were exposed to a terrible attack the other week in Paris. I'm extremely worried about these terrorist attacks that we are witness to in these days, and I'm trying to avoid places with a lot of people. I would rather stay home than go out to restaurants when I'm in Brussels. I'm concerned about where my children are. In my country, Sweden, we are rather vulnerable to future attacks. We've had mass immigration, particularly from countries where there are many citizens, because we are likely to be exposed to this risk of attack, and we really don't know who exactly it is we're letting into our country. And that, Madam President, is, I think, at a time when we're thinking about putting a stop to free movement in Europe, we're seeing a mass movement of people to our countries, and how could we think that these people could be integrated, this number of people? We can't even house a lot of them. We can't get them a roof over their heads. These people come with hope of a better life. They wish to work and acquire a home, and many of them are simply going to end up socially excluded and in a hopeless and desperate situation. And in these kind of situations, it is precisely when young men can be drawn towards radicalisation. The rapporteur was talking about preventive measures and de-radicalisation, reports, etc. I wonder whether the rapporteur would say at this acute stage that we should, as soon as possible, try and prevent more and more of these people coming into European territory. It's no secret that the EU has talked about jihadists crossing the Mediterranean. I'll have to leave it.
Ms. Wimberg, do you accept a blue card from Mr. Le Breton? Yes. Mr. Le Breton, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear colleague, thank you for that intervention. I was very appreciative for the words about the victims in Paris. We've talked about Islamic radicalisation, which is a big danger today. But in the Dati report, that's mixed up. That's worrying. But it's mixed up with other kinds of violence. For example, separatist violence. Would you agree with me in regretting that it's a pity the report is not confined to Islamist radicalisation?
Half a minute.
Thank you. In this case, I think we're talking about terrorism, irrespective of where it may originate, because what we're witness to in our countries is that we are being exposed to a terrible fear. And what I'm saying is that many people are arriving with these refugees, and irrespective of what kind of terrorists they are, we have to fight them, and we must do it now.
Következő hozzászólónk Meyer kép.
Thank you very much. Vicky Meyer, please.
Dank u, voorzitter.
Thank you very much, Madam President. In Paris, Islam showed its real face, again in bestial fashion, the face of evil. And this is very saddening, but it is a source of anger as well. And I'm angry because I've had enough. excuses for terrorism of this kind. It's not the economic crisis or unemployment or whether they feel at home in school. It's other things. There has to be an awareness-raising campaign, and we should not be taking tea with the imams. There are already many de-radicalisation programs and schemes. The only medicine against radicalisation is de-Islamicisation, so that we can put an end to potential terrorists. We're not talking here about traumatised young people. They should be persona non grata, sent away and not allowed back in, because we must begin by protecting the life and limb of our own citizens. Thank you very much.
Ms. Meyer, there is a blue card. Do you accept it? Thank you. You have the floor.
Es por lo menos ya la tercera intervención.
This is at least the third speech in this debate which is xenophobic, criminalizing millions of European citizens and relating migration with terrorism. These are speeches that incite to hatred. I urge the Bureau of the House to take proper measures to punish the members of this House and to stop speeches that are against human rights. How long are you going to continue to allow apologies for xenophobia, fascism and terrorism in this House?
Képviselőtársaim, minden hozzászólásnak helye van, de van az eljárási rendünk, amely szerint...
Thank you very much. Every member has every opportunity to rise to speak, but we do have standing orders, and it's possible to have a blue card, which is an opportunity to ask a question, and I hope that colleagues will abide by that. And otherwise I would not be able to accept any more blue cards.
Thank you, Madam. This report is coming too late. It's no longer any question that terror is a great danger in the European Union. There is a war going on against Europe now. The people are fighting Europe who don't belong to European societies. And now hundreds of thousands more of them are coming to Europe. And we are naive enough to believe that these people can represent European values. I think the report says we need to defend a single value which is against these terrorisms.
Mr. Sver, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. This is a very important report indeed, particularly in the wake of the terrorist attacks in Paris. It emphasizes the need for exchange of information between member states and Europol, as well as the freezing of funds through which terrorists are funded, and establishment of a blacklist of jihadists. These are some of the measures that we can use with regard to a few thousand European citizens who are fighting in these organizations. However, when it comes to radicalization of our youth, the number is much bigger in Europe. Therefore, we need different approaches in terms of education, training, leisure time that our young people spend in their neighborhoods. The European Union remains open for other societies, but we need education for responsible citizenship. Ladies and gentlemen, if we do not give our youth values and competences that will allow them to be included in their European society, then we have failed in terms of de-radicalization of our young people. If we fail here, we will have permanent social and political tensions in Europe, as well as conflicts, instead of a dialogue and open society. And terrorism would then become an everyday phenomenon. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Herr Frunzulica hat eine...
Mr. Frunzulica has requested a blue card, but you will have heard that my colleague and a predecessor in the chair said that she would not be taking any more blue cards. Time is marching on, so if I could stop the blue cards as of now. Josef Weidenholzer has 1.5 minutes. 1 minute 30, on my list anyway. Thank you. I welcome this initiative report, particularly as it comes at a time when the horrific attacks in Paris are so fresh in our minds. This report proposes considered practical measures of attacking this. We're talking here about a death cult which seeks to destroy our civilization and do down our democracy. Crime must be punished without ifs and buts. But it's not sufficient simply to react. We have to go into preventive mode as well. And we must take the measure of the problem and recognise that the roots are at home. The roots belong at home. How it happens over all these years is not possible, no doubt, to solve this overnight. It's been a long time coming, growing, and there is no panacea, but we need to stand united. We need resolve, determination, and also patience, and clarity of mind. There are many good ideas in this report. It's a comprehensive radicalisation prevention and recruitment policy. It suggests that there should be support and backup work in prisons, flanking measures, accompanying measures, and indeed efficient and effective tackling of the way that internet is being used as well. And also money has to go into this. Thank you. Helga Stevens has 1 minute. Colleagues, after the attacks in Paris, we need strong responses, and NVAs can support this report. It suggests measures which have been decided, for example, when it comes to the registration of returning fighters. And priority has also to be given to what's happening on the internet. Internet authorities, they must not have any, they must be forced in a binding way to take down jihadist content. Of course there have to be guarantees for freedom of expression. And can I call on colleagues here to show political resolve and to get down to brass tacks. For example, privacy, data protection, there it's a question of striking a balance. That's the important thing, striking that balance. And can I call on everyone's sense of realism? We're not talking here about people who are by definition per se terrorists. Migrants, of course, are coming into the Union in large numbers, and some of them are involved in terror thereafter, which was the lesson, I think, from Paris. We have got to collect information, disseminate and share the information which is gathered in that way. Thank you. Thank you. Cecilia Wikström has 1 minute 30.
Thank you very much, Madam. Before talking about the Dati report, maybe I would be able to express my condolences to the victims of the attack of the 13th of November in Paris and their families. These are attacks on all of us and against our European values. You should be assured that we will do everything we can to combat these murderers. In Swedish, Madam President, we have to remember that this is not a list of measures as a result of what happened in Paris. It's not a report on anti-terrorism. It is a report about how we are to fight radicalisation in the EU. We have to strengthen the work done in member states to prevent young, weak people being lured into these murderous sects. It's a question of identifying risks early and taking measures, for example, to put people in detention or prison, and we must make sure that these people do not get into the clutches of terrorists, and we have to reduce the possibilities for terrorists and other radicals to perpetrate their sick ideology over the internet. But what we have to do primarily is realize that we are living in times when darkness is falling over the EU, and we have to recall that after the darkest night we do eventually get daybreak, and light will return to Paris, Brussels and other places, and we must all together chase the good things and have our faith in the future.
Danke. Und die nächste Redner.
Thank you. The next speaker is Marie-Christine Vergiat for 1 minute.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. Thousands of young Europeans have gone off to fight in Syria and Iraq. How many today are ready to go after them or to commit massacres here or indeed elsewhere? And let me express solidarity here with Tunis, which has just been the subject of an attack again. So we must do everything to stop these young people moving into action, but we must also look after those who come back. 90% of them, according to a French survey, and they could be valuable allies. They're more and more differentiated, middle class, working class, or even the extremely poor. Yes, they're Muslims, many of them, but they're very often recent converts. Some of them also atheists or even Catholics or Jews. They're more and more differentiated and marginalized and psychologically weak, but perfectly integrated. So yes, by all means, law enforcement, but not only law enforcement. Always, however, in respect of the law, avoiding all stigmatization and all generalization of suspicion.
Cool.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Judith Sargentini for 1 minute. Thank you very much, Madam President. In 2004, in Amsterdam, Theo van Gogh was murdered. I was a local councillor, or rather a local councillor murdered by an extremist and a radical. I was there. I'm glad that I was not there at the moment and did not witness that. But in Amsterdam we had to ask ourselves, what do we do with extremists? And it would appear that that's an extremist who had been subject to eavesdropping by the police, and it was he had a Dutch passport. In the years after that, there were attacks in London, Madrid, Brussels, Paris, and Toulouse, and always people with European passports, and on the in the files known to the security services. And we have to ask ourselves a question: why are our young people being radicalised? We've got to go into the neighbourhoods and not leave everything to the police. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Gerard Batten has 1 minute.
Fails to acknowledge the cause of the current terrorist threat, which is ideological. That ideology is fundamentalist Islam. From its creation, Islam has been propagated by force and violence. President Hollande has said that we are at war. The first casualties in this war must be appeasement and political correctness. We face one of two choices. We can accept eventual submission to the ideology of an ever-increasing Islamic population, or we can take the first step in resistance and end any more mass immigration from Islamic countries. Only then can we start to address the difficult issue of integrating the existing Muslim population. The EU strategy is to deny the existence of the real problem, while at the same time importing millions more people from Islamic countries. Your ideological opponents regard you as fools. History will judge you as traitors.
Next speaker, Janice Atkinson, 1 minute.
I too would like to express my sympathy with the French people these recent terror attacks prove that we have been sleepwalking into a hotbed of the worst of multiculturalism. British values are abhorrent within many of these self-segregated communities. Sadly, multiculturalism is overwhelmingly where the seeds of hate are sown. Since 2012, over 4,000 people have been referred to the UK's anti-radicalisation programme Prevent. Half of them were under the age of 18 years old. But those who have put their radical ideas into action, we cannot have any compassion or show any mercy. Jihadi John came from a middle-class family and can enjoy a wonderful British life, but like hundreds of other radicals turned against our society. Watching porn, using drugs, abusing the freedoms of our society to spread hate and terror. In their nirvana, they would not be allowed to do this. Anyone who preaches hatred and calls for violence should be prosecuted. If they are non-British, they must be directly expelled from the UK. We are at war. We have to fight for our values. We must address multiculturalism and fight for our Western liberal democracy and our very identity, our culture and our children's future.
Thank you. Next is Diane Dodds for 1 minute 30.
Madam President, from my experience of communities living under threat in Northern Ireland, I can tell members of this House that there is no number of bombs, bullets or callous acts of terrorism that can hope to uproot democracy or destroy a free and fair way of life. Like the provisional IRA in my constituency, ISIS can and will be defeated. The starting point in the fight against radicalisation should be everyone in each of our societies coming together to call out these barbarians for what they are. We should be unequivocal in our condemnation. There are members of Sinn Féin in this Parliament. Only last week, their party colleague in Northern Ireland openly said that he didn't consider ISIS to be terrorists. Shameful. In the aftermath of the Paris attacks, I would call on the Sinn Féin MEPs in this House to apologise to our French colleagues for the offence caused by these despicable comments. We must aim to combat radicalism via the internet and support agencies on a national and a pan-national basis with adequate resources and budgets to combat this evil. Moreover, the EU must put in place every safeguard to ensure that the road to radicalisation is not nurtured by directly supporting revisionism. In my own constituency, we witnessed the complete misuse of European peace funds by the Ticullen Centre in South Armagh, where children were photographed in terrorist garb and holding imitation weapons. That is wrong. It ought not to happen. And it is important that it should never happen again. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Lars Adaktusson for 1 minute 30.
Thank you, Madam. The terrorist attacks in Paris show that we have to keep our eyes peeled. We have to break with the naivety that so often characterized our vision of militant Islamism. The fact that the terror sector IS is at war with Europe and the free world is now going to have to guide our thoughts and with the measures that we must put in place. And when you have politics, you end up with legislation, and we must think about how we're going to act to protect European citizens. The time for relativization of militant Islamism is over. Madam President, a shift in the climate of our discussions and the reality of the threat that we now face is central if we are to get into place the measures that we require. The political process which is underway, which is going too slowly, must be speeded up and made real. The Liberals and the Greens will hopefully take their share of responsibility and stop dragging their feet on PNR. Passenger information must be made available to the police, and this is of absolute critical importance. That is the case with tightened observation of our external border and the coordination of the security services in Europe. I would like to thank my colleague Mrs. Dati for the excellent resolution, and I hope a broad majority of this chamber will support it. Thank you.
Next, Peter Niedermüller for 1 minute 30. Thank you, Madam President. The terror attacks in Paris are still very fresh, but we can see that already there are politicians who are exploiting those events for their own purpose. The Hungarian Prime Minister talked about terrorists being sick, being immigrants, but we know there is no direct link between immigration and terrorism. We know for sure that French and Belgian individuals were responsible for the terror attacks in Paris. They grew up here, and they have not come in on a wave of immigration. I think that's again proof that these are not. I think we've got to be careful when we talk about nationals and non-nationals. Let's not forget that hate and fear are not going to lead to solutions. That is a political approach which leads nowhere and simply allows more and more people to be radicalized. What we have to begin by doing is understand why radicalization takes place, what the rationale is behind that, what the logic is behind it as well. We're not talking about forced cultural assimilation. I believe that young migrants in Europe also have to have a future.
Frau Monica Macovei für eine Minute.
Monica Macovei is next, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. The 5,000 European citizens who went to fight alongside terrorist organizations in Iraq and Syria are also our failure. We should look at the root causes of this phenomenon and we should prevent this figure from getting even bigger. But first and foremost, we must stop any terrorist threat and any terrorist attack in Europe. And we need to take urgent measures. First of all, quick adoption of the Air Passengers Directive, the so-called PNR Directive. Also, the dismantling of terrorist groups by fighting illegal financing, first and foremost. The blacklist of, with regard to sources of terrorism are Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq. These are a few countries that finance terrorism through organized crime, corruption, money laundering. The money that is being laundered, money laundering for terrorism should become a serious crime in each and every member state, and this must be strictly applied. The financial institutions must refuse to open anonymous accounts, and the real beneficiaries of companies should be identified. Thank you.
Der nächste Redner ist Herr Gérard Deprez.
Next, Gérard Deprez, 1 minute.
Okay. Afterward. No.
Ici, Madame la Présidente.
I'm over here, Madam. Madam President, I welcome Mrs. Dati's report in its present form. It's a good synthesis of the initial proposals and of the proposals for adjustments and additions coming from the political groups. It's an excellent basis on which to work against radicalisation. But having said that, I'd like to take this opportunity to say a few more personal things, as I'm Belgian. And our country, as you know, is at the moment in living difficult times, and we very much appreciate the solidarity of other countries, but I am a bit worried by what I read and hear about my country in particular, and about the borough of Molenbeek. I know my country's weaknesses, and I know particularly Molenbeek. But you shouldn't turn the district of Molenbeek into the single European centre for jihadis. The only attack so far committed on Belgian territory was carried out not by a citizen of Molenbeek, it was a Frenchman. The people who committed the attacks in Paris, or 2 or 3 of them at least, don't come from Molenbeek, they come from Syria and other nationalities. These are not Molenbeek people who killed. The crime was a multinational one, and we have to fight it multinationally.
Before I call the next speaker, Mrs. Spinelli wishes to rise on a point of order. Mrs. Spinelli. Yes, Madam President, on a point of order. something which was said by Mrs. Dodds earlier on. And can I ask, is it possible to make accusations of complicity with ISIS directed to a delegation and a party represented in this Parliament, Sinn Féin? If it's not possible, then what measures can be taken to ensure that proof is adduced, evidence is adduced for such a scandalous and implausible accusation or allegation? Thank you.
Danke, Frau Spinelli. Wir werden uns das ansehen.
Thank you very much. We will certainly look at the rules and examine the precise words used. Madame Eva-Joly, 1 minute, please.
Madam President, colleagues, we are seeing a mobilization against terrorism without comparison. We've got the police and the military, and we are having to fight to prevent young people falling into the clutches of jihadism. We face propaganda, but we've got culture and education on our side. These are the redoubtable weapons of democracy, and no fight against terrorism will succeed if we don't at the same time fight what it engenders. The fight against radicalisation is not going to go down the road of stigmatizing Islam or PNR collection or just trying to get more and more data. It is about understanding the mechanisms and trying to prevent the passage to radicalisation and violence by young people of all backgrounds and cultures and social classes. And we have to fight inequalities and the frustration that gives birth to easy manipulable young people falling into the hands of Daesh. And I think we mustn't allow our societies to be turned back against ourselves. It is important that we maintain our cohesion. That will be our best approach.
Next, Ignacio Corrao for 1 minute. Thank you, Madam President. Commissioner, I believe that the debate on the report regarding radicalisation comes at the wrong time. Because we do have the Paris attacks and the aftermath thereof in our minds, and the emotions are running high. And I think we've got to approach this from a different direction. I share the concerns which have been expressed and agree that these are grave developments, and radicalisation is a terrible thing. But it's wrong to think we can solve that by means of an enforcement-driven approach, rather than preventively. And I think that's a pity, because we talk about repression, about a law enforcement approach, and we quite quickly end up restricting personal freedoms. And I think that the reaction of the member states has not been a smart one or an intelligent one, because experience after attacks on Afghanistan, all that happens is more terrorism and another wave. We've got to be longer sighted and to take a different tack. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Sophie Montel has 1 minute.
Le rapport qui nous est présenté.
The report put before the House is characteristic of the ineffective and dogmatic Europe that you've been building for years. You think that a few more obscure European agencies and the lack of still more sovereignty will do something, but they're all in the image of Frontex. They simply organize the development of the problem they're supposed to solve. France is looking after its security, and inside and outside Schengen, murderers have been able to move around freely and killed 130 people. You're thinking of European propaganda, massive propaganda, as the sole response to jihadist propaganda. You want to have a firewall in the internet, like in China, and you are trying to develop communitarism, while it is exactly communitarism that has made Molenbeek a hotbed of jihadists. It's love of the fatherland that we need here. French people need, behind secure borders, a national identity that they accept proudly and an exciting national destiny.
Next speaker is Yorgos Epitidios for 1 minute. Madam President, the measures which we are proposing to prevent the recruitment of young European citizens by terrorist organisations will not be effective, because we're looking at the symptoms and not the causes. We are reluctant to teach our children to love their countries, because we don't want they don't want to be accused of being nationalists and extremists. We don't teach them Christianity for fear of being accused of being backward-looking and conservative. We don't teach the history of our countries, so we are not seen as racist and xenophobic. The fact is that our politicians are corrupt, and they are taking an economic-driven approach, and that's increasing the hordes of unemployed young people, which make young people more prey to the propagandists of the jihadists. And the fact is that they are stripping young people of a hope for the future, and we owe it to our children to attack the root causes and not just the symptoms, and to make sure that our young people have a future and they are able to bring to bear their skills and their abilities and proficiencies and not succumb to propaganda. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mrs. Barbara Kudrycka, 1.5 minutes.
Pani Przewodnicząca, chyba wszyscy zgadzamy się.
President, I think we all agree that now the EU has to face refined campaigns of disinformation, which are widespread online, but also in schools and prisons. The transnational character of terrorism allows fanatics throughout the world instant communication and recruitment possibilities. So I think it is good and opportune now that the Commission is proposing the development of new community methods for fighting the radicalisation and terrorism. But in order to fight effectively radicalisation, we need to step up our efforts in order to fight hate speech, which is now flooding the internet. We have to find legal definitions which would allow us to clearly ascertain what is hate speech and what isn't. Now, I welcome the fact that the Commission wants to step up its cooperation with the online sector. On the other hand, our police forces should prosecute those who promote radicalism. Member States should cooperate in such areas as exchange of information and police cooperation that would allow us to implement the new measures proposed by the Commission. Thank you.
Next speaker, Tanja Fajon, for 1 minute 30.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner. Terrorists are successful where people of different religions and backgrounds live in distrust, and where stereotypes, hate, xenophobia are promoted. The perverse abuse of religion is one of the reasons for radicalisation, and so is also social exclusion. Over 5,000 young European citizens have joined terrorist organisations. We need a clear fight and a clear plan on combating terrorist recruitment. We need an effective exchange of best practices, exchange of information among law enforcement bodies on radicalisation in Europe, and we need to fight illegal arms trade. It is necessary to prevent radicalisation in European prisons on the internet. The role of education and social inclusion need to be strengthened, but we also need a strategy for dealing with those young people returning after they've been disappointed by their involvement with the ISIS. Socialists and Democrats have published a brochure with key priorities in the fight against terrorism, which does not only lay emphasis on security response, but also on addressing causes for the spread of terrorism, war and poverty in third countries. I agree that the effectiveness of external controls should be improved, but I disagree with the measures adopted by some European governments which have introduced stricter border controls and are profiling migrants and refugees based on their racial or ethnic origin. The statement by the Hungarian Prime Minister Orban that all migrants are terrorists is a threat to our democracy. Thank you.
Thank Thank you. Next is Beatrix von Storch for 1 minute.
Ja, Frau Präsidentin, vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Dati has presented a report on radicalisation and the recruitment of young people to terrorist organisations. Now, if you wake up in the dark and you can't see your hand before your face and you try and turn on the light, it's a little bit like that with this report talking about education and financing of terror organisations, but there is something missing because the light simply isn't turned on. The report doesn't even mention the fact that radicalisation is the flames of it are being fanned by the West because of interventions that we've carried out. Every bomb that we drop stirs up more hatred. IS and its supporters are monsters, but the West has had a hand in that. We shouldn't feel comfortable. We have to turn the light on. We cannot talk about radicalisation without thinking at the same time about the Western interventions in the Middle East.
Thank you. Next, Javier Nart, 1 minute.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Madam President. I have here with me the resolution 2014 at which at point 8 it says the European Union should criminalise and prosecute all institutions which trade or finance or support in logistics is the Islamic State. I asked the Commission 2 questions on 2014 asking what investigation had been made, what companies had been investigated and prosecuted, and the answer is a disgrace because it's none. And when I asked again, and I'm still waiting for an answer, if we come now to the second part of my question, how do the militants of Islamic State get here? They go through Karkamis in Turkey. And my question is this: if we cannot in the European Union implement the decisions of the European Union and Commission, how can we ask Turkey to stop militants, more than 5,000 of them, moving through that country to turn into Islamic State militants?
Thank you. Next, Bodil Valero, 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I think we're forgetting an important factor here. Perhaps we talked too little about it. That is the fact that there is a human behind every terrorist or every person that's radicalised. And in the majority of cases, the terrorists we've seen in Europe have grown up here. They are born and bred in Europe, but they haven't managed to find any calling or meaning in their life in Europe. And we've got a lot of people around us who are struggling to find a purpose in life and perhaps find more meaning in death than life. And in that we have a huge problem. If you're looking for a reason, you want to have community with other people, and it's easy to end up in the group or in the company of other people who are strong and are fighting for what they perceive to be the good. And whether it's extreme right-wing groups or extremist terrorist groups, they themselves think that they are in favour of everything good. And we have a huge responsibility, therefore, to take a close look at why people are being radicalised, why people are deciding to go for death rather than life.
Thank you. Next is Georg Meyer for 1 minute. Thank you very much, Madam President. We need to recognise where our weakness is and our cowardice is, says the rapporteur. And let me try to help. You really have to address the core of the problem. You seem to be blind in that eye, and that means you'll not be able to get to the root cause. And I'm saying this not in order to condemn a whole religion or a faith. If you look at the Paris events, then I think it's particularly naive not to accept that there is to say that this is down to a lack of integration rather than religion as such. But please, you clearly don't want to address the religious core at the heart of this problem. And whether now, whence now, whither bound now. Remember Charlie Hebdo. the fact is that these hate speeches are being made, they will continue to be made. As long as that's the case, nothing will change. Thank you very much. Bruno Gollnisch has 1 minute.
Madam President, I hope that Mrs. Albiol is not going to ask for me to be punished by Mr. Bush, as she did for a previous speaker. But I'd like to pick up what Mr. Meyer has just said. We're blind. We're not seeing that there is a religious dimension to these atrocious crimes. People say there's no link with Islam. Of course there's a link with Islam. Of course not all Muslims are terrorists just as well. But these present terrorists refer to Islam and to their reading of the sacred texts, which unfortunately doesn't undermine their criminal actions. And we must also recognize our major responsibility for having destroyed the only political force that could fight radical Islamism, as to say, Arab nationalism, which the West and the United States destroyed in Iraq and in Libya, and we're getting ready to destroy in Syria. And then we find, to our astonishment, that in this vacuum a different kind of identification emerges, which attracts, of course, the young people in our suburbs. It's been said that they're French. They probably should never have become French, but Mr. Niedermüller, that's a different problem.
Der nächste Redner ist nun Herr.
Thank you, Tomasz Stokowski, for 1 minute 30.
Dankeschön. Vážená paní předsedající.
Thank you very much, Madam President, Commissioner, dear colleagues. After the terrorist attacks in Paris, we are clearly confronted by a terrorist threat across Europe, and we need to recognise that our security and integration policy has failed. We cannot close our eyes and kid ourselves or delude ourselves when it comes to failed integration of migrants. We're talking here about the first, second, third generation immigrants, and that was unrestrained immigration, which has helped them to be radicalised and leave to take part in terror. Now, I'd like to congratulate Mrs. Dati on her report, which has encompassed all of the aspects of tackling terrorism, and it flows clearly that we now need closer cooperation and a proper exchange of information, including third countries. We must bring in all citizens, and that's the only way that we're going to be successful in the fight. But we are losing. Time is going by, and 5,000 people are already on their way.
Rednerin ist nun Frau Iliana Jotova.
Thank you very much. Next is Mrs. Jotova. 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm persuaded that all of us in this hemicycle wouldn't wish that this discussion had been so awfully topical. The report must rapidly become the basis for a legislative initiative of the European Commission. External borders of the European Union, and I underscore the European Union and not the Schengen area, have to be strengthened when it comes to financing and resources. This is not a measure that would deprive citizens of their rights, but quite to the contrary, it will actually help to guarantee their security. Secondly, we need more control and checks on those routes taken by foreign fighters who go to the Middle East and come back from there, and we must have specific commitments for common actions with our neighbouring countries. Now, these measures will not prevent radicalisation. What we are noting in our countries is that there are lost generations, there are isolated ghettos, poor people who have few prospects, who easily become the victims of radical movements. Will we really have the courage to break with stereotypes and bring about real integration? We have to give these young people the confidence that they can believe that they belong to our world. It's in that way that they will be by our side. Let us hope that the efforts of recent days to form a true grand international coalition against Daesh will eventually be able to destroy the source of evil as soon as possible. Thank you.
Danke. Der nächste.
Thank you. Next is Kazimierz Michał Ujazdowski for 1 minute.
sprawach kulturowych, w sprawach...
On issue of culture, issues of our civilization, we have to be brave to act for our safety and security. Our civilization, based on Christian culture, is under attack. The attacker is not something abstract, it's radical Islam. This must be said clearly and outright, not to discriminate against anybody, but civilizations fall when they no longer believe in their own values. Please note, in Central Europe, where societies follow Christian religion, there is no terrorism there. And finally, on a different subject, we must be brave in our actions to assure security. I appeal to socialists to change their positions. We need controls at borders, we need a directive on PNRs, but we also need extraordinary solutions, expelling own nationals who are responsible for acts of terror. Nationality is not a right given to destroy your own society.
Thank you. Next speaker is Laurentio Rebecca for 1 minute.
After the Paris attacks, a press article, a newspaper article, has been disseminated around the world and shows the hideous face of the terrorism, of religion-based terrorism. This article shows the revelations of a European citizen, an Islamic fundamentalist, a second-generation European who is sick and tired of waiting for a suicide mission. He accuses the Saudis of favoring their relatives for suicide missions. I'd like to remind you that this person is born and bred in Europe, and he was indoctrinated and turned against the society that welcomed his parents. In this context, I think that the measures required by the current report should be implemented urgently. I think it is high time for Europe and the Member States to have two essential laws packages. First of all, a control of internet traffic in order to block access to websites that propagate this ideology. A second law package should be needed in order to prevent the access of European citizens.
Thank you. Lambros Foudouris has 1 minute. Thank you, President. Many of us are asking how to reverse recruitment, but it's the same people who encourage the growth of Islamism and made it possible to resist that in any practical way. And let's not forget, these are not all unemployed, poor people. Marginalisation in Belgium, that is not, that doesn't justify anything. And Greece, with 60% unemployed, I mean, if unemployment was the reason, then we would be reeling from terrorist attacks in Greece, given the amount of... The fact is that we're talking here about Islamic extremism. And these are imams who are working irrespective of whether the local authorities tolerate that or not. They have come, they're Salafists, Wahhabites, they have been sent from Saudi Arabia, and that is what the... let's stop the post-colonial attacks also, because that certainly does not help. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Next is Barbara Matera for 1 minute 30.
President. Thank you, President. I'd like to congratulate Mrs. Dati, who's worked on a complex text attempting to cover all the aspects of this absurd phenomenon. Violent extremism and intolerance very often arise out of marginalization and poverty. But those reasons can never be justifications of such violence. Some 5,000 European citizens have become foreign fighters, and that proves that the integration policy has failed. Now, I don't want to fall into the silly temptation of assuming that Islamism represents terrorism, but it is quite clear that monitoring at borders needs to be stepped up, and everybody coming into our territory must be registered. There can be no exceptions to security. And I think we need stringent measures about online data, and we need to close on the trilogue on PNR with intra-European flights included, and closer cooperation with social media management companies, and a speedy reform of Europol. Let me conclude with Article 3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. Every individual has the right to life, to freedom, and to the security of his own person. Without security there is no freedom, but the opposite doesn't apply. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next is Madju Lauristin for 1 minute 30.
Aitäh, proua president.
Thank you, Mrs. President. I would like to stress that the fight that is going on is a fight between different values. It is an attack against European values, not an attack against Christianity. It's a fight against the values that date back to the French Revolution, to Kant's philosophy. And all this is done under the cover of religion. But actually it's just another form of fundamentalism. We all remember manifestations of Nazism, of communism, and we should not be surprised. We should just think about our historic experience, how young people have been brainwashed, how people who are feeling bad, who do not feel at home in their own societies, how easy it is to win them over. And this is why we should think how to improve European education, European media, the relations between ourselves, so that those relations would be honest and equal. And the first victims to this, in this fight could be us. If we start using the same stereotypes among ourselves. This is why I was very sad when I saw the campaign that was started by one of the political parties here against another political party in order to claim democracy as theirs.
Thank you. Next is Marek Jurek for 1 minute.
Danke, Prezydent. Człowiek jest istotą.
Thank you very much, President. Man is free by nature, and we are not in a position to change somebody else's thinking. We are all responsible for our own actions. Therefore, any form of glorification of ISIS, of glorification of terrorism, should be met with a clear legal reaction. If there are imams who preach the ISIS ideology, if they are foreigners, they should be instantly expelled. If not, we should ask ourselves a question: if people who preach hatred of the society where they live, if they should be treated as citizens of such a society. But we can and should the future of our children. But we will not do this by trying to institute censorship, as Madame Guzman said, censorship of those who are criticizing the consequences of migration, or by censoring such politicians who dare defend us, like Mr. Orban. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next is Nicola Bay for 2 minutes.
You have a point of order? Then please.
Excuse me. Now, sul telefonino.
On my mobile phone, there's been an attack in Roubaix. There are hostages, including children. I simply wanted to inform the House thereof, probably Islamic in origin, the attacks.
Danke für die Information. Wir werden sehen, was da tatsächlich passiert ist.
Well, we shall see what happened and who was behind it. The next speaker is Nicolas Bay for 2 minutes.
Le rapport
Madame Dati's report relates to prevention of radicalisation and recruitment of Union citizens by terrorist organisations. Our debate today comes 10 days after the odious attacks that bathed Paris in blood, 10 months after those that struck the newspaper Charlie Hebdo and the hyper Kasha supermarket. You say in the opening statement that the radicalisation must not be associated with a particular ideology or religion, but it is Islamist fanaticism which generates terrorism in Europe and bathes France in blood. Unfortunately, this denial of reality is characteristic of the short-sightedness of our supposed elites. The French Minister of the Interior said just a few months ago, and I quote, "It is not an offence to promote jihad," and when our good-heartedness towards the Islamist gangrene, when our Foreign Affairs Minister says that Frontal Nostra, that's to say Al-Qaeda, is doing good work, or when the report that we're debating today qualifies terrorists as fighters, or when Eva Joly says that we have to give these people another chance, it is time to put a stop to this excessive optimism, and the fight against Islamism cannot be done by means of toll-free numbers of follow-up sessions with psychologists. It's time to take the measures that are required. We have to close Salafist mosques and ban Islamist organisations. We have to strip the binationals of people with dual nationality of the nationality that is related to jihadist networks. We have to give proper human and material resources to our police. And finally, Commissioner, at the end of this debate on terrorism in Europe, you dared to declare that Schengen is not the problem, it is part of the solution. However, it is this Europe which is a bridge that has allowed the attacks to happen in Paris, through the Isle of Lesbos, the enclave of Molenbeek, those that are born in Europe and others circulating freely, Islamists circulating freely here, and we have to get back control of our borders.
Francesc Gambús for 1 minute and a half.
Gracias, señora presidenta, señor comisario.
France and Europe have been attacked, and in the face of the serious threat facing us, the only possibility to defend is union. We have to act together without divergence. After all these attacks, Tunis-Roubaix this afternoon, we need to meet the international community in order to find a solution to the uncivil conflict going on in Syria, and that will stop this being the root of the ISIS terrorism. And we must work tirelessly to stop the radicalisation of citizens living within the Union, with priority measures being integration, which is necessary, as a first line of prevention. And the Dati report moves decisively in that direction. But it's also necessary and inevitable that we have a joint structure with more police cooperation, leading us to a federal European police based on the European Criminal Code that the Lisbon Treaty envisages, and at the same time advance further towards common European policies that we need, like one for asylum, one for migration, and give a real sense of state to the cooperation and development policy. Over our development and our history, Europe has had to fight against barbarism very often, but Europe has always managed to remain and evolve to where we are today. We must make it clear once again that they will not beat us. We must fight against all those who attack our security. Europe and democracy will survive, the terrorists won't.
Juan Fernando Lopez Aguilar is next for 1 minute 30.
Thank you, Madam President. Commissioner, you said that this is a timely debate, and it is. What isn't timely is to mix it up with a debate on foreigners, or on migration, or on refugees. This is a debate about what Europe can do to prevent European citizens being recruited by terrorist organizations. And the added value is here that we should learn to look at the content on the network, on the net, that incites to radicalization. And we also need to stop terror recruiting in prisons. And we need to prevent not just the arms trade through sophisticated measures, but also the financing of indoctrination towards terrorism, and we need to free people's assets at freeze assets at European level. We also need police cooperation, sharing information on these 5,000 Europeans who've come back after being trained in terrorism somewhere abroad. And we also need to denounce the fact that austerity and the abandonment of education policies and inclusion and integration policies in marginalized places, particularly vulnerable places, all this has meant that a lot of European citizens born as such are prepared to embark on this mad spiral of destructive violence and self-destructive violence. And they say they are ready not just to kill but to die, not just to die but to kill while they're doing it. Let's hope that the Dati report will give added value at European level to this European response, which is more necessary than ever.
Thank you. Next is Balchaki for 1 minute 30.
Madam Chair, I welcome this document, although I did not expect that it would become so highly topical so quickly. We must realize that the EU has only limited possibilities to act, because the key areas such as justice, execution of sentence, protection of the EU external border, as well as the implementation of educational programs, fall within the competencies of member states. I should like to underscore the principal fact, which in my view is of great importance if success of these activities is to be achieved. It is the need for the member states and the EU institutions to sincerely and effectively cooperate. We have to realize that we depend on each other. Any attempt to go it alone could only result in weakening the results of our joint action. The current situation requires us to employ flexible information exchange systems between security authorities, including intelligence services. It is necessary to also strengthen the powers of Europol and to provide information from their system to national law enforcement agencies. It is necessary to take active steps against aggressive preachers. I also agree with the idea that foreign fighters upon their return to their respective countries should be placed under court supervision. We must not forget effective educational projects. Quite a significant delay exists in this area, and it is necessary at last to act vigorously in order to dry up funding of international terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Ismail Ertug, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Colleagues, I would like to express my sorrow because there are 1.7 million Muslims who are being equated with terrorists by the people hating right at the house. That isn't right. We're talking about the prevention of radicalisation, and I think we have to learn lessons from the past, but we have to think to the future. I would say that what is decisive at the end of the day is that we have to show acceptance and understanding for people in society and their individualism, and we have to express appreciation for cultural backgrounds, and that, I think, is decisive. Society, after all, shouldn't exclude people, and a strong society must be able to get by without bans, and I think we have to proceed against terrorism and racists with harsh measures, and I think what has been outlined in this report is a step in the right direction. But let's not forget that we're dealing with people who have grown up in countries here and consider them to be their own.
Thank you. Christine Revaud-Dallon-Bonfoy is next for 1 minute.
Merci. Face aux attaques terroristes.
Thank you, President. Faced with the tragic terrorist attacks in Europe and elsewhere, we have to take strong measures to guarantee security and safety for Europeans, and also go to the root causes affecting young Europeans of all social backgrounds. That's the purpose of this, and our group, S&D, made a major contribution to that. We need preventive long-term policies in school, in the neighbourhoods, on internet, and mobilise everyone. People on the ground, the associations and education people have to be educated themselves and trained so that they can work in the neighbourhoods and detect the early signs of violent radicalisation. We must help families as well by means of having a number they can call to report any signs of radicalisation. We must also crack down on those who preach, in the literal sense, preach hatred. Violent radicalisation is a real scourge. And let's not forget that these young people may end up being perpetrators, but initially they are victims. Thank you very much.
Caterina Chinnici.
Thank you. Caterina Chinnici is next for 1 minute.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Madam President. The terrible events in Paris and what's happened this afternoon again in France, and the fact that Brussels has been involved as well over these days, all of this should lead us to look carefully at why some European citizens join terrorist organizations. The attackers were young people with European passports, so we must have an in-depth reflection on the integration policy of the social cultural kind that we need to avoid this sort of episode. Prevention in itself means get there first, and we have to get in first, before social exclusion, before radicalisation, before hatred, before new tragedies. We also need at European level stronger cooperation between judicial forces through Eurojust in order to make it easier and faster to identify suspects, and we must have better and faster exchange of information with police forces and Europol. Mrs. Dati points out that we need to move and move fast in an undivided way. We need a constant dialogue to prevent radicalisation and to share information in order to fight the recruitment of young citizens by terrorist organisations.
Thank you. Next, Bogusław Liberacki, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. Radicalism and terrorism are not new phenomena. We've had this before, but now it's at a huge scale using modern technologies. Our basic values are under threat: tolerance, freedom of movement, and finally new technologies. Among the terrorists, there are mostly EU nationals, people who live among us. Those who were shooting in Paris were not asking who was Christian, who was Muslim. They were just shooting at everyone that was in their vicinity. Prevention activity is of key importance. Fighting hate speech, controlling the internet, and obtaining cooperation from the public, and limit financing possibilities for radicalism. That's where the problem lies. And finally, we need more EU, more community method. Thank you.
Danke sehr.
Thank you very much. We now move to Catch the Eye. And what I intend to do is that each group can have one Catch the Eye speech, and particularly those who have not spoken in this debate. And the first is Michala Šojdrova for 1 minute under Catch the Eye.
Kolegyně a kolegové, je naší povinností zajistit bezpečnost a bojovat proti všem příčinám násilí a nenávisti.
We need to fight against all causes of violence and hatred. In the European Union, we should draw lessons of the risks of a multicultural society. There are excluded young generations who are not educated and have few prospects in life. They represent a major risk. They're the disappointed ones. They're looking for a sense to their lives. That's why we are proposing a series of specific measures in prisons, better control of internet, better training, more work with young people who are at threat. We need to have internal and external security instruments, but none of this will be enough if the number of disappointed people continues to increase. Europe is based on Christian roots, and we cannot give up those values. We must always insist on security as well as on freedom.
Next speaker is Viorica Dantilla, again for 1 minute.
Wenn sie nicht im Raum ist.
She is not in the chamber, so the next speaker is Sajjad Karim for 1 minute.
Ist auch nicht anwesend. Gut.
He's not in the chamber. Good. Or is he? No. No, you're not Sajjad Karim, though. I realise. So, here are the Voutmans, please. Who is? 1 minute, please. Madam President, Commissioner, many people this afternoon have said that the timing of this debate could not have been more topical only a week after Paris, and at a time when in Belgium and Brussels we are confronted by a high level of threat. Now, can I just repeat what Mr. Deprez said earlier on? The focus, don't put all the focus on Belgium and Molenbeek. All of our countries are affected by radicalisation of young people. It's not unknown in other countries. So let's not apportion all the blame. I'm the mother of 2 small children, and I must say it's very difficult for me to understand. How is it that young Europeans leave for Syria to go and wage war, which is not theirs? We must invest heavily in prevention, and let's give more assistance and backup to local authorities to keep up the fight against anti-racism and discrimination. And young people who come back, they must be punished. They must be put behind bars, and only if we cooperate can we live in safety and without fear. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I can now take one speaker from the S&D and the ECR, because the names they give us were not in the chamber. Nicola Caputo has spoken already, but if there's no one else from his group, Mr. Caputo can have the floor, and Mr. Marias as well.
Grazie, Presidente. La discussione di...
Thank you, President. Today's debate is particularly significant following the Paris attacks. The tragic events of recent days have put Europe dramatically in face to face with the problem of terrorist recruitment and the need to prevent radicalisation. These are men and women, above all young European citizens of all social origins, who have in common a feeling of alienation from society, and they represent a threat to security in Europe and elsewhere. But radicalisation needs to be fought apart from in other ways than law enforcement. We need cultural links with the various religious communities and exchanges across the world. We need to understand the financial networks that underpin these terrorist networks. What pushes people to become terrorists inside the Union will only be dealt with if there's a fight that is intransigent against terrorism, combined with social integration of people who are not terrorists.
Und nun Herr Notis Marias.
Now Notis Marias for 1 minute. Thank you, Madam President. Jihadists and terrorism in Europe must be tackled on the basis of its ideology. ISIS, Turkey, there are links, they're being confirmed every day in international press, demonstrating the links between Turkey and ISIS, not just in Syria but also in Libya. And the Turkish involvement in Syria is compounding the problem with Daesh and the bombing of Kurds. The Turkish secret services are involved. There is a video channel which gives coverage of conversations with the jihadists. And we are talking here about a hub, and we know that arms shipments are going from the Turkish coast to Libya, and there was one which was intercepted in Crete, and we must address the Turkish contribution. Thank you very much. Thank you. Javier Couso Permuy has got a minute.
estos asuntos.
Thank you, Madam. On subjects like this, we shouldn't respond in hot blood. There are no shortcuts. We learned this in Spain. 143 people killed, 1,500 injured. There are no ways away from asymmetric threats in Europe. The xenophobia and Islamophobia is not the way out. We have to have a memory. We have to get away from the destabilizing agendas in places like Syria and Lebanon and Iraq. We need to form alliances on the ground. There are Gulf states financing this, or financing the spread of Wahhabism and hatred. We shouldn't abandon the rule of law when what we've got is a failure of intelligence. We have to fight asymmetries on the other side of the Mediterranean and within our own districts, because it's only with stability and justice that we'll have security.
Danke sehr auch fürs Einhalten der Zeit.
Thank you for sticking to time. Next is Bill Etheridge, 1 minute.
Thank you. Recently I attended an interfaith event in Birmingham in the West Midlands of England, which is within my constituency. The heading for the event was Love for All, Hate for None, and it was organised by the Muslim community there, but there were Sikhs, Hindus, Jews, Christians and some of no faith, all coming together to unite behind civilised values, to respect the rule of law, to respect democracy, to love the country in which we all live in, and to actually stand up for something decent and good. There is no need for any one particular section of the community to be generalised as being the problem here. Judge people on their merits. If you find that people are good, that's great. If you find that they support the barbaric evil of ISIS, they must be fought and they must be beaten and stopped in their tracks for good.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Buonanno is last in the Catch the Eye. Thank you very much, Madam President. I simply wanted to give an update. It seems that there was a robbery which took place in Roubaix, I now learn. At the end of this debate, Madam President, we in Europe, how can we persuade the 500 million Europeans that we are really worried about Islamic terrorism? How many people are in this room, in this chamber? And it's just the number of people the amount of interest we can drum up in a continent where European politicians are destroying our very civilization, where you've got a horde, a pack of Muslims. Of course, we're not putting them all together in the same, not lumping them all together, but there are ones who are behaving very badly, who do not believe in our values, and they should be sent away. Turkey, for example, look at this. This represents ISIS. These are bastards who should all die. So that's the end of the Catch the Eye. Now, Commissioner Avramopoulos to reply.
And I would like to express my thanks for this fruitful discussion we had in this House at a very timely moment. It focused in one of the root causes of the problem, not to everything, and where the solution should come from as well. In our collective effort to address this issue, to fight radicalisation, we must by all means avoid to stigmatise any community, any ethnicity or origin, whether they are Muslims, refugees or migrants. As I said, and as many of you repeated as well, almost all perpetrators of the last attacks on European soil were homegrown, and religion any religion has nothing to do with their acts. Radicalism has. Fanatism has. Hate has. Relating terrorism with migration is stirring up hatred and leads to a vicious cycle. I am really glad and proud to participate in a discussion in a parliament where members from all the democratic spectrum defend our values of respect, of tolerance and of acceptance. I would like also to praise Mr. Kirchhoff's intervention. I hope that common sense will prevail in our working together to face the common threats. And for this, we have different means that the Commission is working since months to put at the disposal of all Member States. Exchange of information, closer cooperation among law enforcement authorities and agencies, stronger legal framework against terrorism and detection of terrorist threats, effective management of the external borders, stricter rules on firearms, targeted cooperation with key third countries. But the basis of an effective response is addressing its roots, and that is the central subject of today's debate: countering radicalisation, both in the real world and the virtual world, both by legislation and by schemes of cooperation with the private sector, both at local level and with the exchange of best practices among Member States. And all this in calmness and firmness, without demonising anybody. Madame la rapporteure, chers collègues du Parlement,
Madam Rapporteur, colleagues of the Parliament, well, she's left, so you can pass on to her what I'm saying. Thank you for this debate. Our work isn't over yet. We stand united in our fight against radicalisation and its consequences. Thank you very much for your attention.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kommissar.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Shortly, briefly for your information, Madame Dati has informed the House that she had to go, and she used the 6 minutes at the beginning because she had to go and look after her daughter, and that's why she had to leave. So that closes the debate, and the vote will take place tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, before I move on to the next item on the agenda, can I briefly tell you that I hope that the hostage taking, which is currently ongoing in Roubaix, according to media information, will come to a safe outcome, and that there will not be anyone hurt, and that it will be ended peacefully, and that we will not have a new attack by ISIS or anyone else. Ladies and gentlemen, we now move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the joint debate on the EU industry of base metals. This is the report by Mr. Martin on developing a sustainable European industry of base metals, and the Commission statement on anti-dumping measures and their effects, the impact on EU industry steel. I begin by calling the rapporteur, Edouard Martin, who has 4 minutes. Rapporteur, you have the floor, sir. Thank you very much. Good evening. Thank you, Madam President, Madam Commissioner. Yes, indeed, we're now turning to a very complicated report, because, as you will all certainly know, Europe is the victim to massive importation of steel from China, Russia, elsewhere, at rock bottom prices, undercutting EU production. And I'm glad that we're able to put this into context. 11 months, the price of steel has been cut by half, which means that there are countries which can really undercut EU production. What I wanted to do was to give you that headline and to put paid to the people's fantasies who say, well, you've got to choose between industry on the one hand and respecting the environment on the other. In the report, I bend over backwards to make the point that it's possible to do both, to make industry strong in EU with the basic inputs and respecting the environment. But of course that requires an investment effort. And since the 2008 crisis, we have been underinvesting. And this has had an impact on our competitiveness and indeed on the environment. And this is where I would like Europe and indeed the European Parliament, this side of COP21, to defend, to take the urgent decisions which have to be taken. And Europe, of course, is a continent is reconciling the industry and environmental sides. Let's not forget that if we make a ton of steel, we produce CO2, but if the Chinese produce steel, they also produce CO2, and it's a ratio of 2 to 3. They produce that much more CO2 in producing steel. And let's not sound the death knell of our industry. Look at the statistics. China has 350 million tons of overcapacity for steel production, and EU consumption is the equivalent of 170 million tons. Now you can see, with a decline in Chinese industry, we are seeing dumping and public aid, and they're going to be trying to palliate and mitigate over. We are seeing Redcar being closed in the UK, thousands of jobs being closed down, people being put on short time everywhere in France, Spain, Italy, elsewhere. The real fundamental question which we all have to answer and address, and which I put to you, Commissioner Bieńkowska, is, do we want an industry at European level at all? And we're talking here about survival. We have to move quickly. We cannot wait 6 months or even 3 months. Measures must be taken as of the 1st of January 2016 if we want to come to the rescue of this industry. Now, in my report, what I'm recommending is that we use trade defence instruments in a more proactive way, anti-dumping measures. And this tax on adjustments at the border, this is only fair play. It's not saying that we are going to crack down on pollution at home and then have an open door to the outside, to Russia, Brazil, China. So this is not just Chinese steel makers. Clearly, in industry they're saying they need visibility when it comes to energy contracts and transparency. And I think the answer to that is long-term contracts. And of course, compensating for the indirect costs of CO2. Let me remind you, this report